how is it that we get to be like we are? Well, that's really the underarching question of all psychology, is deciding who we are. B.F. Skinner, in his behaviorist theory, said that we're products of our environment. Our environment works on us, and that's how we turn out to be who we are. Well, Albert Bandura, in his studies as a psychologist in the early days, he was fascinated by what Skinner had to say, and yet he thought, and through his observation, he recognized that really what happened was our environment works on us, but we in turn go back and work on our environment, that it's a two-way street. And that two-way street, as a matter of fact, after a while he began to recognize that it was really a three-way street, if there's such a thing. That is, that it's not just our environment working on us and us working on the environment, but a third leg of that triangle was that there was that cognitive process, what goes on in our heads that you can't really quantify, you can't nail it down, and yet Bandura saw it as crucial to who we are as human beings. As a matter of fact, that break with classical behaviorism is what made him into the father of cognitive psychology, that you can't do away with the mental process part of our being. And so that was what he called reciprocal determinism. The environment works on us, we work on the environment, and our cognitive process informs both of those activities going on. So, reciprocal determinism and the father of the cognitive movement. Now, in his most famous studies, that is, with what he called the Bobo doll, and apparently back then you could actually go to the store and buy one of these blow-up dolls, and it had a weight in the bottom, and when you knocked it over, it would stand back up, and that was a little doll of Bobo the clown. And what he did was, he got some kindergartners together, and he, at first, did it with a live model, and later on, because it was cheaper, he started filming the model doing this. But they would get the Bobo doll, and they would show the kindergartners this scene of a model going up and kicking over the Bobo doll, and hitting it, as a matter of fact, and even taking a small mallet and whacking it on the head. And every time doing that, saying, "Sockaroo! Sockaroo!" and various other what he thought of as aggressive phrases. And then, after showing them this scene of the model doing this to the poor little Bobo doll, and by the way, because people criticized him for just using a doll, that he actually hired a clown to do this, and the model would go up and hit the clown with the same little mallet. Now it was sort of a humane mallet, but so that the Violence Against Clown Society wouldn't get after him. But the fact was that the model was doing this to a live clown, and then what happened when the kindergartners got let loose? Well, sure enough, they ran and grabbed the mallets and started saying the exact same thing that the model did. "Sockaroo!" and whacking the Bobo doll. And then even, whacking our poor hapless clown. Which, by the way, you might want to thank yourself for going into psychology and, not clowning, as far as psychologists are concerned. But what he found out was that these kids could learn merely through observation. There wasn't a direct stimulus that they were getting. There was no positive reinforcer that they were receiving for learning this. And in classical behavioral psychologists, there should have been. And instead, they just thought it was fun to whack on the doll. And they did what the model showed them they could do. So that he saw this as what he called observational learning, which he got through those famous Bobo doll studies. That you could learn simply by observing what was going on. And this happened in 3 different realms. And that is attention. That is, you had to pay attention to what was going on. You had to be able to receive the information that was coming. Second, retention. You had to have the mental ability to keep that idea in your head. You had to be able to keep it for long enough to act on it, He called that mental images and verbal descriptions. He had a way of describing the mental process that went on in our heads. And finally, reproduction. That is, acting out what you had learned. You had to have the ability to reproduce the action that you were doing. Now, all of this was informed by the fact that there would be motivation to do it. And then the motivation was key in that it was part of the learning process. It wasn't what we got out of it. It's part of the process itself. So, the attention, retention, reproduction informed by motivation really formed the cornerstone of what Bandura thought of as observational learning. Now, this led him to believe that there was an ability within this observational learning to do what he called self-regulation. That is, that it came down to our ability to control ourselves through our desire and willingness to control our own behavior. That depended on three things. First, self-observation. You had to know what you were doing at any given time. You had to be aware of your actions. You also had to have judgment. That is, you had to be able to compare your actions with the actions of others. You had to be able to look and see, ooh, look at what they're doing as compared to what I'm doing. And finally, self-response. You had to respond in a way that positively moved you in the direction you wanted to be. That is, rewarding response, and that's what he called self-efficacy, feeling good about yourself and doing the right thing that moved you in the direction you wanted to be, or the self-response of punishment. That is, having the negative responses to the actions that we did that were not positive, that didn't help us out. And that came in the punishment came in the form of compensation, that is the superiority complexes, or driving a big yellow Hummer. No offense to the big yellow Hummer drivers. Inactivity, apathy, depression, or even escape through drugs or alcohol, or even, as he thought, the ultimate escape of suicide. But he thought that the self-regulation through self-judgment, through self-observation, judgment, and self-response was how we could move ourselves, control, or regulate our behavior toward that which we wanted. And finally, he saw this as a way of dealing therapeutically with people through what he called modeling therapy. That is, that you could see a model doing an action that was going to work in a positive way for you, and you could actually replicate what that model had done. And he did this through people who were afraid of snakes. They had this phobia against snakes, and he sat them down to watch a model whom he was told was a model and not somebody that was really afraid of snakes, would walk up to a snake, would back away, would give themselves self-talk of positive reinforcers, and then finally be able to approach the snake and end by actually putting the snake over their shoulders and wearing it like a feather boa. He found out that in many cases, people who watched the model do this, even knowing that it was just a model, would be able to overcome their phobias simply by doing what they had seen done. In other words, taking the Bobo doll study and using it for therapeutic purposes. And in that way, Bandura was able to use his cognitive approach to psychology to help people. So, let's go through a few more questions and then we'll go over a quick review. So, learning by perceiving the behavior and consequences of actions in others' individuals is a case of respondent conditioning, instrumental conditioning, developmental conditioning, or observational learning. And of course the answer is observational learning, learning by seeing it done. What is self-efficacy? That is, when one's self-esteem is based on the achievement of society's standards and standards of one's previous performance. So, basically feeling good about what you've been able to accomplish. What experiment was Albert Bandura famous for? A. Beating up on children. B. The Bobo doll study. Or C. Rocket science. And, of course, the answer was B. The Bobo doll studies. For Albert Bandura, learning involves what three processes? And the answer is attention, retention, reproduction, as informed by motivation. Now, some things to remember about Dr. Bandura. Social learning theory, that is learning through observation and modeling. Social learning theory. Bobo doll studies that led to the observational learning theories that he had based on attention, retention, reproduction, and modeling. Reciprocal determinism, that is, that environment, behavior, and the cognitive process formed a triangle by which we come to be who we are. And self-efficacy, that is, feeling good about who we are because we've done a good job. And I hope that's what you do, because that's what you need to know. Good luck.